Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking some seriously complex, provocative source material and breaking it down so it's super clear and focused. We're investigating a highly controversial article from Gospel Reclaimed, and they make a staggering claim that the traditional Christian doctrine of eternal conscious torment is a massive historical and theological distortion. The author argues that this widely accepted concept isn't just wrong, but it actively works against the core message of the gospel. It's a really bold stance, and we are going to unpack exactly how they build this argument step by step, looking at both the deep theological claims and the profound practical implications.
The entire thesis of our source material revolves around one single central question. Can a God of infinite love maintain a realm of infinite torment? The author uses this ultimate theological paradox to launch a sort of myth-busting detective story. They suggest that when you put the concept of endless torture right next to the concept of endless mercy, you get severe cognitive dissonance. The source argues that we literally cannot hold on to both ideas without fundamentally fracturing our entire understanding of divine justice.
To ground this high theology in really practical human terms, the author shares a striking quote from their own sister. She said, "If my daughters are going to hell, I choose to go with them." The source uses this raw human empathy to expose what they see as a major flaw in modern doctrine. The author basically asks, is a human mother more loving toward her kids than God is toward his own creation? When fallen, everyday human compassion seems to outshine the character of the God being worshipped, the author argues that something has gone catastrophically wrong with our theology.
Section 1. The Ultimate Theological Paradox. Let's see where this begins.
According to the source, the concept of a torturous afterlife is completely absent from the very beginning of the biblical narrative. When God warns Adam and Eve about the tree of knowledge, telling them they will surely die, the author frames this not as a threat of divine retaliation, but honestly like a loving parent saying, "Hey, don't touch the hot stove." The warning was just about the natural destructive consequences of mistrust and separating from the source of life. When Adam touched the stove and got burned, the Father didn't create a torture chamber to punish him. Instead, the source notes, he rushed in to heal the wound.
The author takes this even further by looking at the famous definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13. Because Scripture literally states that God is love, the author substitutes the word God for love in this passage. The result? God is patient and kind. He keeps no record of wrongs. He never gives up. The source argues that a God who keeps no record of being wronged and never gives up fundamentally contradicts the whole concept of a God who eventually just stops forgiving and throws people into endless torment.
Let's move to Section 2, the Greek and Roman invasion, and see how this builds historically.
This comparison between Hebrew and Greek thought is absolutely vital to the author's argument. They contrast the original Hebrew view of the afterlife with the later Greek philosophical view. Ancient Israelites believed in Sheol. This was a shadowy, silent waiting place that was, quite simply, the grave. It was the end of breath shared by everybody, with absolutely no flames or torment. But as Greek philosophy, particularly the teachings of Plato, began to mingle with Hebrew faith, things shifted. Plato introduced the idea of immortal souls that had to be rewarded or punished in dualistic realms like Tartarus, which acted as moral prisons. This was a massive theological shift that totally changed the practical reality of the faith.
The author really emphasizes that the Old Covenant people had zero concept of eternal conscious torment. When figures like King David or the writers of Ecclesiastes spoke of death, they spoke of Sheol, the grave. The source asserts that ancient Israel feared non-existence, not eternal torture, and that hell, as it's preached today, never even entered the ancient Hebrew imagination.
So how did it actually become dogma? Well, we start in ancient Israel with no concept of hell. Then Greek philosophy introduces the immortal soul, but the real turning point, according to the article, hits around 400 CE in the Roman Empire. The author points to Augustine of Hippo, who merged Greek dualism with Roman imperial politics. The source argues that as the church became an institution of the empire, the doctrine of endless punishment became incredibly useful for state control. By the Middle Ages, through Latin mistranslations like the Vulgate, hell was fully weaponized. It became a dogma used to sell indulgences, fuel crusades, and basically enforce submission through sheer terror.
Moving into Section 3, the problem of exceptions. Now we look at the practical contradictions.
This maze of exceptions brilliantly illustrates a major practical issue. The source argues that if eternal torment is an absolute rule, modern theology suddenly requires a dizzying array of hypocritical loopholes just to make it morally digestible. I mean, are unborn children spared? What about unreached tribes who literally never saw a Bible? Do they get an ignorance exception? What about severely abused kids or those with severe mental disabilities? The author argues that health theology only survives today by inventing all of these arbitrary carve-outs.
This leads the author to ask a piercing, practical question. Does divine justice rely on a cosmic lottery? Think about it. If salvation requires navigating geography, avoiding severe trauma, having a certain IQ, or speaking the right language, then the author argues it isn't divine justice at all. Their critique is that if you have to invent this many exceptions to soften the cruelty of a rule, you must eventually admit that the underlying rule itself is fundamentally flawed. From a purely theological standpoint, the source claims the logic just completely collapses under scrutiny. They list several massive cognitive dissonances. For instance, how can God be omnipresent if there's a separate eternal furnace where he supposedly isn't? How can all tears be wiped away if unending weeping is happening simultaneously somewhere else? And perhaps the biggest practical hurdle of all, how can a finite life of, say, 80 years be justly punished with an infinite, never-ending penalty? The author argues that this totally destroys the very definition of justice.
The author reserves their most intense critique for modern Calvinism. The source describes a teaching where God supposedly creates many people with zero chance to escape hell, and that this somehow displays his justice and mercy to the elect. The author's verdict here is completely uncompromising. They label this a demonic doctrine that completely annihilates the good in the good news, arguing that it turns grace into a cruel, manipulated lottery.
Let's look at the alternative in Section 4, the restoration alternative.
To reframe our understanding, the source uses this really powerful quote from theologian C. Baxter Kruger. So the crucial point is this: we've been taught to view God's love and justice as opposing forces. You know that God is love, but he must also be just, which requires endless retribution. But the author argues that true divine justice is entirely restorative, not retributive. God's justice is all about making wrong things right, fixing what is broken, and restoring creation. And that actually aligns perfectly with his mercy.
This leads right into the author's ultimate theological takeaway. The cross wasn't just a partial rescue mission. It wasn't some lifeboat sent out to save a lucky few while the ship sank. According to the article, it was the collapse of every single distance between God and creation. It was the absolute death of death itself.
The author backs this up with an absolute avalanche of scriptural evidence, arguing for total triumph. They point to verses stating Jesus abolished death, the promised restoration of all things, and the Revelation account where death and hell themselves are ultimately thrown into the lake of fire and destroyed. The author's profound theological argument is simply this: if evil, death, and torment exist eternally right alongside God, well, then Christ failed. If hell lasts forever, then sin, not grace, gets the final word. And the author absolutely refuses to accept a theology where Christ fails to undo what Adam started.
The author draws a hard line in the sand with this final statement. They write, "I refuse to numb my conscience to make room for a doctrine that would shame any earthly parent." Based on everything from deep historical context to practical human empathy, the source completely rejects the concept of retributive eternal punishment. They argue that returning to the original Hebrew understanding and the restorative nature of Christ radically transforms a religion of fear back into a gospel of incredible universal triumph.
We'll end today's explainer with this provocative question, inspired by the writer George MacDonald. Will good souls one day be horrified at the things they now believe about God? The source leaves us reflecting on this really profound tension. The gap between the traditional dogma of endless torment and a restorative, radically loving God is vast. Whether you agree with the author's conclusions or not, it certainly forces us to think deeply about the nature of divine justice, the origins of our traditions, and what we truly believe the good news was meant to be. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this deep dive gave you some fascinating material to chew on.